Day DRX announces that Rb and Zest have gone to the reserve roster, which is basically just them, by the way, saying that they're benched or that they're going to try and use them for some tier 2 team that they're collaborating with. I don't think that this means that they are just on the reserve roster in order to save some money, because that's a thing that could happen if you had during the offseason some players that were on ridiculous salaries, but then they also had a separate reserve roster salary. You might put them on the reserve roster, but to do it in a big announcement tweet like this, and the fact that they've been trying to bench Zest forever. I mean, I made a joke about it yesterday, didn't I? Where I was talking about Zest being benched in the middle of their game against Sentinels. And then I woke up this morning and he is actually benched, like permanently this time too. But they have been trying to bench Zest for a lifetime. And RB has gone from being a Stardew List player who couldn't really perform at big events to being one of the best flex players in the world. And now he's apparently getting benched too. And there's conflicting viewpoints on this within the community. We'll get into that in a moment. But they've decided to replace these players with Flashback and Foxy9, which is the roster that they were using kind of recently. If you scroll to one of their recent tournaments that they were playing in, like I think they played them at Red Bull, didn't they? Yeah, at the Red Bull tournament, they're playing with Foxy9 and Flashback here. But I think that this is a really bad move. And I'll kind of go through some of my reasoning for why that is. But first of all, I just want to get to setting some of the context of like the community reactions as well. I've seen people on both sides of it. I've seen people just being like, Termy, you bastard, you've done it again, you son of a bitch. I'm not even sure whether Termy is still head coaching this team, but presumably he is. I haven't seen any hard evidence to the contrary, just a few rumors that he was being phased out. And some people being like, this team obviously needed some change. They've been struggling all year. They didn't have the firepower, etc., etc. And I don't even really know where to start except to go back through this year. So to look at what DRX did this year, they finished third at Champions 2022. And I felt while we were watching that tournament play out that they'd broken through the glass ceiling for teams in the... not teams in the APAC region entirely, but for certain themselves. The fact that they made it to the lower bracket final, and they were moments away, almost, from reverse sweeping Optic. They lost the first two maps in fairly dominant fashion, actually, but managed to claw their way back on Fracture and on Ascent. Two maps that Optic were very good at the time, and then had quite a close final map, too. It felt like DRX had some opportunities to be able to make it to a grand final, something that they hadn't done. I mean, they hadn't even made third place before. So it definitely felt like DRX were on the cusp of doing something. And then let's ignore all of this off-season stuff, because they love to do wonky stuff in the off-season. But they come into VCT lock-in, and all of the conversation around lock-in was about the fact that they had been scrimming with Foxy9, this replacement player for Zest, up until right before the tournament began. And then they just gave up on that. And so for the first matches at lock-in, you had them playing with their old roster with Zest. But Zest had basically no playtime with the team at lock-in, because they'd been using some of the off-season and all of their scrim time heading into Sao Paulo to be practicing with this alternate roster. And that really just set the tempo for the entire year. They didn't even perform that badly, to be honest. This roster, which was still fairly fresh off the back of Champions, it's, later, what is that, almost 6 months down the road? 5 months down the road, yeah. But they still used a lot of their old strategies, and they looked fairly decent. They managed to take down Cloud9, which is the biggest scout that they got at lock-in, which I think that would have been a very good team. It's a pity that we didn't get to see them play a bit more, so that people don't really respect this result, because they're like, oh yeah, it was the Yay version where, they had role issues, etc. But I think that would have been a very good team had they stuck together, and we would have looked back on that as a big win for DRX. And then their game against Loud was really close too. They looked like a top contender at the beginning of the year when everyone else was looking a bit shaky. And then throughout their Pacific, they just carried on this same narrative of wanting to play with Foxy9. They had Foxy9 in for the majority of their regular season. And then as soon as they lost a game in the playoffs, this game against PaperX, as soon as they lost it with Foxy9 going -11, 0.6 impact rating, as soon as they did this, they just bailed on Foxy9. And they just subbed in Zest. By the way, Zest, again, not scrimming with the team as far as we can tell. Not participating actively with, he'd obviously been keeping himself sharp because he came in with a lot of new ideas for what he wanted to do. But my dude is having to play Sova, Fade, Brim, and Harbor in a BO5 match. And he still held his own, having not really had too much scrim time. They were playing a lot of very set stuff with Zest in the roster as well, because they had to go back to... They couldn't play as loose because they just hadn't been scrimming with him. They had to rely on a lot of hard execs, hard post plants that looked very rigid. And they ended up losing their grand finals 3-2. Again, not playing with Foxy9, abandoning Foxy9, and not really sticking to a game... like a game plan that revolves around having a set 5 roster. It was absolutely bizarre. And I tell you what, Masters Tokyo was the worst I've ever seen this team. It was shockingly bad. Seeing this team just run hard execs in a meta that was to do with baiting out defensive utility was dreadful. The way that they just sent Foxy9 in to die on repeat, because again, they started Masters Tokyo playing with Foxy9, trying to make it happen. Guess what happens when they lose a game? Guess what happens when they lose a game here? They play against EG, they lose with Foxy9 in, they're playing an elimination game against Foot. Oh, by the way, Foxy9, you're fucking benched again. We're getting Zest back in. So they had just, all of this to say, they trolled. And as Bala says in the chat, not a single elimination game all year by Foxy9. They didn't want to even risk elimination with a player that they were trying to build up. So they subbed him out every time their life was on the line in a tournament to play with their old roster, which wasn't going to be as good as it could have been anyway, because they weren't scrimming and playing matches with their main roster, at least if you want to call the Zest roster their main roster most of the time. So they, the entire year, fucked around and found out. And they found out that they were a lot worse when they fucked around. That was, if you're looking at the year in total from DRX, the only big thing that you can take away from it is they messed their roster around so much that you can't even tell which roster, what the potential of the roster, either of them could have really been. Now, if you want to get a bit more detailed on the analysis than that, the Foxy9 roster, they always had issues with his entrying. He didn't look that intelligent on the entry. This is now the player that they're going to be committing with full-time that isn't always going to be playing entry, because recently when they've had Flashback and Foxy9, and sometimes Buzz is still playing Jet, but Foxy9's going to be doing probably quite a bit of the entry work for them. And that is... I don't think he's as good as Buzz, for starters, and that's one of the players that he's replacing in that role. I think he's very all-in, and I think that's a team problem as well, but he's got massive spacing issues, frequently ends up way ahead of the rest of his team, and he definitely needs more time to develop in this role. And Flashback too, actually, if you want to talk about Flashback, the player that they've brought up, Flashback's a really awesome potential player. He's a Viper main, basically. We haven't seen him play pretty much anything else. I think he's played a tiny bit of Killjoy too, but his Viper's really good. He's got cool setups, he's got a good understanding of how to play it, and he's an excellent aimer too. He's bringing a lot of good mechanics to the team. By the way, not like Rb and Zest weren't, especially Rb has got some very good fragging, but Flashback's really crispy. The problem is, he also looks pretty inexperienced, even though he's playing in some big off-season tournaments at the moment and having some all-right results, not some amazing results. I mean, again, take a look at their match page. They've been losing to Foot, who are admittedly pretty decent. They've been losing to Cloud9 as well, who, again, pretty decent, have been winning some bigger tournaments. Not bigger tournaments, but some like smaller tournaments like the 10 Invitational. But they haven't been lighting the world on fire out here in the off-season with this roster. And one of my main criticisms with Flashback is that they've just got him hard lurking almost every attacking round in the post plant. So he does his job and he stays alive, but he's super predictable, always doing the same kind of things. And I'm worried because that is such a DRX thing, to have a player just do the same thing over and over and over in every round. Have your entry do the same pathing every single time they hit a site. Have your lurker have the same timing every single time they make a play in a post plan. And it worries me that there's almost a formulaic way that DRX like to train their talent, and I can see the issues with it in both Foxy9 and Flashback. And like I said, they haven't demonstrated outrageous potential with this roster in the offseason. But I guess the positive side of it is that they are now committing, right? They're committing to Foxy9 and Flashback. But here's another potential issue that I see them running into. They've got rid of Zest, who is a really flexible player. I was talking about the fact that he was playing Sova, Fade, Brim, Harbor in a BO5 in the finals. But also, RB is like one of the most flexible players, one of the flex players that is asked to do the most and delivers really frequently. And these are not bad players either. You look at what RB's been able to do in big matches for them. Get him on Killjoy, on Haven. He is going to clutch like crazy for you. And Zest as well, despite being fucked around all year in a manner which I'm amazed he has the patience for, he still managed to step up and have some decent performances. They were up and down, but I think that's to be expected. And I also don't really understand, if you look at the timing of things, if we talk about up and down results being expected, in the most recent performance in the Africa TV League, they'd been playing the off-season with, if you look at DRX's kind of, sorry, not stats, if you look at their matches that they've been playing recently, all of these games in the off-season, with the 10 Global Invitational on the Red Bull home ground, were with the Flashback Foxy 9 roster. And then in the Africa League event, they played with the Zest RB roster. This team had almost no practice since Champions, I suppose. That's a huge amount of time ago. They looked really rusty as a result of that, but they also achieved, to be honest, similar results to the other squad during the offseason too. They beat they beat Full Sense, but it didn't look convincing, so that's, you know, not looking great. They lost to Sentinels, who won the tournament, and they lost to Paper X, who ended up coming second in the tournament as well. They had a tough group, and sure, DRX are of the quality where you expect them to get out, but no team is going to play well if you don't let them practice for months at a time because you're changing the roster around on them all the time. So if this was supposed to be I don't know whether this was supposed to be the last hurrah for the fans to just wheel them out, even though you were already planning to cut them in front of the audience in Seoul, or whether this was supposed to be like their final chance, and unless they performed really well, they were getting cut. I don't fucking know what's going on over there in the DRX camp, but it is just absolutely bizarre, isn't it? To get RB and Zest out for like one last ride in Group A, have their shit pounded because they haven't really been practicing, and then put them into the retirement home on the bench and see if you can pedal them off to a tier 2 roster. Isn't that just absolutely bonkers and entirely what DRX have been doing all year long? It's just wacky. I don't think that... So, I was talking about the community consensus earlier being very split on this issue, and one side of the camp believes that this is a good move by DRX because this version of the roster was not going to win a championship. And to that I say, how the fuck do you know? They didn't get a chance this year. They came third in Champions, and they weren't allowed to compete seriously in any tournament that they played this year. Apart from, you could argue, Champions, where apparently after Masters Tokyo, even though Termi said, and get this, Termi said at the end of Masters Tokyo in a press conference as they lost at Masters Tokyo, yeah, we actually have been planning this the whole time. Like, you're not going to be disappointed at Champions. We've been building Foxy 9 up. I know it looks a bit dodgy at the moment, but like, trust us, we've got this for champs. Foxy 9, it's going to pay off. It's going to pay off, guys. Just trust us. And then he fucking didn't even play Foxy 9, and apparently immediately after Masters Tokyo, I don't know whether there's some kind of coup inside the team or whatever, but they just decided to stick with that 5-person roster with Zest playing instead of Foxy 9. So all of the work that they'd done, sacrificing and compromising both of those rosters to get experience on Foxy 9, they just bailed on it. And I think it was the right move as well, heading into Champions. And I think that's one of the reasons why their Champions performance ended up doing the best out of all of it. So it does smell like serious internal issues going on, but I think a lot of that has got to be put down to the coach's decision to keep rotating the roster around. Players don't rotate rosters like this. Players are not as fickle as this. Now, that doesn't mean that in general I like players having roster control either, but when you have a coach that's making this level of moves, it's just... You didn't get to see DRX play a proper tournament the entire year, apart from arguably Champions at the end, where they beat Loud, who placed third, beat Na'Vi, who are another really good team, who were actually performing really well at Champions as well, from the little that we saw of them, and they ended up losing to the eventual winners of the tournament, EG, and the best team of the year, Fnatic. So that's not a horrendous performance from DRX, really, is it? They were clearly the 5th best team of the tournament, and maybe you could argue that they looked more like the 4th best team, depending on how you would power rank things and whether you give them credit for beating Loud earlier on or whatever. But there was a lot of not clear power rankings in the top, in the like 3 through 5 of champions, because different people were beating each other depending on their play styles and who was hot on the day. So anyway, not a bad tournament result from DRX. And I think if this team, my theory is, if this team had not been fucked around all year by a Jekyll and Hyde coaching staff, I think that they would have replicated similar results from Champions 2022. I think they would have had a top 3 in a tournament at some point this year. I think Masters Tokyo was theirs for the taking had they actually had good experience heading into it, because Paper X were nerfed. The general quality of play was pretty poor at Masters Tokyo overall, although DRX also contributed to that. But like Loud wasn't playing particularly well too. So if all the rest had stayed the same, but DRX had not been messing their roster around heading into it and had come in with a lot of prep to Masters Tokyo and been focused on the meta and trying to optimize that rather than trying to optimize their roster, I think that would have been a great tournament for them to try and punt for like a top 3 result in. And instead, it was a disaster for them, an absolute disaster. But I don't think the roster is the issue. I don't think you actually got to see. How can anyone argue that you got to see Zest play his best this year? It's a fucking joke. But anyway, I'm pissed about this because I feel like Zest and RB are both extremely good players that got undersold on this roster, and I'm kind of concerned about what this roster is even going to be doing when they play in different metas. Like, for example, Foxy9's going to mainly be the entry player for them, right? Buzz is now going to be mainly the Sentinel player. Flashback we've seen play Viper. Stax is the initiator. Mako's the secondary smokes player. What happens if you're not playing a double smokes comp? What happens if you're playing a double initiator comp? Well, I would assume in that situation, Foxy9 becomes your initiator because he's played a little bit of KO recently. But Buzz has also played KO in the past. But like, what if you're playing Breach Sova? If you want to try and run a Breach Sova composition with this team, this 5-person roster, who plays Sova? And if it stacks, who plays Breach? It just doesn't. It seems like a very all-in roster for a double smokes comp, unless we're missing a lot of information about what Flashback's agent pool looks like, which we might be, because we've only seen him very recently on the big stage. There's not that much data from him in DRX prospects, but I think that's actually what they're going to do, Ryan. We simply won't run Breach Sova. We simply won't run 2 hard initiator compositions. The problem with that is you don't know what the meta's going to be. You don't know if the meta's going to lend itself towards that direction. They do have a good roster for running double duelists with Foxy9 and Buzz, but again, same kind of problems with Foxy9 being overly aggressive, and that's also something that Buzz struggles with, not the spacing issues, but making too many hero plays. And guess what? They've just cut their 2 biggest role players. The 2 guys who are willing to suck up the shit and play like role players, like glue players, flexing to whatever their team needs, making sure they're always there for the trades. Yes, Mako and Stax do some degree of that as well. In fact, quite a large degree of that as well. But Zest and RB were quintessentially that. And I mean especially RB. I'm not too opposed to trying out a slightly different roster, but I think the idea of getting rid of RB, who just filled a hole in every compositional issue that you had, is a little mad, frankly. But we'll see what happens with this DRX roster. I haven't seen... I can see some potential with it, but I think it'll take a lot of work because Foxy9 and Flashback are both still got things that they need to improve on. And I think that Buzz also has some hero play stuff that he needs to tone down. And the team in general has some macro things that they need to improve on. And they spent all last year dicking around. So if you're high on this team being able to win a tournament or make a deep run with this new roster, you have to assume that the coaching staff is now going to stop fucking around because they've finally settled on a 5. And yeah, that could be a positive. You've got to really hope that they continue to improve Foxy9 and Flashback. Bear in mind, guys, they didn't really improve Foxy9 the entire year. Foxy9 was about as good at the beginning of 2023 as he was at the end of 2023. He didn't really make that much improvement. And while Flashback does seem to be frankly, even better than Foxy 9 already. He's got some small things that could be improved with his gameplay, mostly around being a bit too formulaic. And again, I just don't know whether I trust his coaching staff to be able to make the changes that they need.